Hi, Russ here, and I'm back with something that I think is actually a tag. I think I've created a tag without really meaning to. I will explain. So, this month, May 2020, we seem to have loads of lovely readathons of various kinds going on, and one of them that I wanted to do was Springathon. Springathon hosted by Emma, Natalie and Juliana, who I'll kind of credit down below in the description. But and the prompts for Springathon are to read a non-fiction work of nature writing, and then to read 5 other things with 5 prompts like bird, animal, water, And I realised, well, I could certainly do the nature writing non-fiction book, but there was no way that I was going to get in 5 other books for Springathon, as well as all the other things I want to read in May. And then I thought, oh, I know how I'll solve this one. I'll kind of cheat a bit, but in a nice way, and I'll find a poem for each of those prompts, which I will read and enjoy. And as I embarked on doing this, I realised that there's probably other people out there that are semi-doing Springathon and maybe won't get to kind of hit all the prompts. And I thought, why not share some poems that match the prompts and offer up a kind of like a tag challenge to you to read these five poems which I've picked. They're all what would I say? They're all available online, so I can link to them below, so it's easy for you to get to them. They're all quite short. This is only going to take you minutes to get through and read all 5, unless you want to think about them for hours, which of course is entirely up to you. But if you just want to read them, done in minutes. They're all quite accessible. I think they're all accessible poems, but they've all got something about them of interest, something that makes them, I think, worth reading. So your tag challenge is to read the 5 poems, then one for each prompt, which I will go through in a minute, to comment on all 5. But I know people get a bit kind of hung up at the thought of like having to do poetry criticism, it makes people anxious. So it's fine just to say if you liked it or not and why, or not even that if you don't really want to. But the other optional bit of the tag is that for each of those 5 prompts, to come up with a poem that you like or a short bit of prose that's kind of like your alternative suggestion for our kind of Springathon sprint version, instant Springathon. Okay, so I'm going to go through my 5 and in the hope it will inspire you for yours. So the first of the prompts is birds, and for that I've picked The Thrush's Nest by John Clare. Now John Clare was born in the 18th century when he was writing poems sort of early 19th century, and he was a sort of young man from rural area, so kind of like farm labourer kind of background, so an unexpected person to become a successful poet, but he did. He wrote lovely poems about nature and the countryside, which actually became really quite fashionable in 19th century England, and then have been revisited and rediscovered maybe over the years. Every now and then people kind of rediscover the loveliness of John Clare. The Thrush's Nest is one of those poems that it's sometimes nature poems, and I'm going to give you some other examples, like the nature in it is almost like a metaphor for something else. But no, The Thrush's Nest is just about the joy of observing the nature around you. Which is why I like it, I think. Prompt number 2 from Springathon is water. So that can be river, sea, ponds, clouds, rain, snow, whatever, water. And for that, I've picked for you A Short Story of Falling by Alice Oswald, which is a poem from 2016. Now, I've enthused about Alice Oswald on this channel before, so I thought I should go for an Alice Oswald poem. She writes quite often inspired by nature, although also sometimes by the classics, all sorts of things. But I chose A Short Story of Falling because it's a book about it's a poem about how water permeates natural life, which was an interesting concept to me. But the other thing that I like about this poem is that it's in rhyming couplets, and I think it's quite a challenge now to write in rhyming couplets without it sounding a bit silly, but in my opinion she pulls it off. So tell me what you think. Prompt number 3 is animal, and that's any kind of animal, insect, reptile, mammal, fish, any. Okay, and the poem I picked for that for you is The Trout by Seamus Heaney. Now, again, if you watch this channel, you'll know I'm a bit of a Heaney fan. And this is a poem he wrote it was in his collection that came out in 1966, so it's a relatively early Heaney poem. And this is one of those poems where, on one level, it's a quite accurate evocation of a fish, the trout, of how it behaves, what it looks like, how it moves. But the vocabulary that he uses to describe it, which keeps mentioning things to do with guns, all the sort of similes and metaphors in the poem are kind of linked to firearms, and you have to feel, reading that poem, that he's talking about a trout, but he's also commenting about Northern Ireland, which is where he grew up, and his sort of Irish, the conflict in Ireland that sort of persisted all through his life. So and I like nature poems that also, I like using nature to also talk about something else, as long as they don't kind of like they're not honest about the natural bit as well, if that makes sense. See what you think. Prompt number 4 is plant. So tree, flower, ferns, grasses, fungi, any kind of plant was the prompt. And I've been going on a bit lately on this channel about a Scottish author called Kathleen Jamie, and my non-fiction nature writing work for Springathon is one of her books of essays, which I've very much enjoyed, called Surfacing. So I wanted to pick a Kathleen Jamie poem, and I picked one called Daisies, and it's one of those nature poems that kind of homes in on a simple detail in nature, and the simple detail here is about the way daisies close when the sun goes down. And when you read a poem like that, you're left wondering, is there another layer to what she's saying here? Should I be understanding this another way? So like with the Heaney, it's kind of really explicit, whereas this is more subtle, and it kind of, you're left with more questions in your mind, perhaps. See what you think again. The last prompt is travel or destination or a place, and for this I've picked a poem called A Day in Sussex by Wilfrid Scarwen Blunt. Now, Blunt was an interesting 19th century man. He was born in Sussex in the middle of the 19th century, lived into the 1920s. So born in sort of, I've probably written it down, 1840, and he lived to 1922. And posh English gentleman who was fascinatingly anti-imperialist in his thinking, pro-Irish Home Rule, ended up in prison because of that. Also, not a bad poet. And I picked A Day in Sussex because it's a poem about the Sussex countryside, which I love. But it's a poem about how sometimes we don't have to travel very far to go on a journey, as it were. He writes in it about leaving the loud world and going and spending a whole afternoon just lying in the grass in the countryside of Sussex, and how that memory of doing that kind of stays with him and sustains him in his life. I found that a very appealing sentiment. It's quite kind of traditional 19th century style of poetry, it's not, sort of all pre, modernism and so on, but something in the idea that I found quite appealing. So that's my 5 poems. I will really look forward to hearing your reaction to those 5, and 5 that you might choose if you choose to do that as part of the tag. Now, the observant amongst you will have noticed that, of course, there is another prompt in Springathon, which is to read a work of non-fiction, nature writing. Now, one of those interesting things about poetry is that poetry can be fiction or it can be non-fiction. It's quite often non-fiction, and nature poems often are non-fiction. And I would say that the John Clare poem, The Thrush's Nest, is actually a kind of classic example of a non-fiction poem. It's really just straight description, just in poetic form. So I would say that if you do read all 5 of these poems, you will have completed the whole of Springathon in mini form. And I'm going to tag some people because this is kind of a tag. I'm going to tag 2 booktubers who last year did a little project about kind of like beginner's guide to poetry, reading some different poets and then picking one of their works to talk about, and I really enjoyed it. And that's Kelly of Books I'm Not Reading, and Brian of Bookish. And so I think you both enjoy these 5 poems and be able to come up with some of your own perhaps. I'm going to pick Tilly of Tilly's Shelf, obviously because she's my daughter, but also because I know that she's reading a non-fiction book for Springathon, but there's no way she's going to have time to do all the other prompts. So fast track your Springathon, Tilly, using this. I'm going to pick Steve Donoghue because we know he likes being tagged, and we also know that he feels the need to be more fragrant. And what could make you more fragrant than reading some nature poetry in the spring? Also, he's bound to come up with some nice kind of something by Ovid or whatever he could probably do every single one of these prompts with a poem by Ovid. Feel free to do that, Steve. And the last person I'm going to choose is Hannah of Hannah's Books, because I love it when she reads poetry aloud on her channel, and so perhaps she might pick a poem that she reads aloud to us, and that would be a pleasure. So have fun people with your Springathon Poetry Challenge Sprint instant readathon success tag.